So back to Jesus. In Jesus' day, there was one figure in all of the history of Israel who loomed larger than any other. And that figure was the prophet Elijah. Moses was important, but Moses was not near as important as Elijah. Elijah lived in the 9th century before Jesus, and his story is actually told in the Bible in the book of Kings. In his day, he challenged the people of Israel to stop worshiping foreign gods. And the story that is told there about Elijah is that his prophecies got him in trouble. And he lived most of his life in the wilderness, living the life of a wilderness prophet in dress, in the kind of food he ate, in his look. All about him was this wilderness prophet that you can imagine. He traveled for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, where Moses had received the 10 Commandments. He was the only prophet in the Hebrew Bible ever to go to Mount Horeb and ever to go back there and to actually have an encounter with God in the way that Moses had encountered. Different because there he had that still small voice instead of the 10 Commandments. He performed miracles. He raised people from the dead. And significantly, for our story today, he himself did not die, as the story of his life is told. But he was taken up into the whirlwind. And in the book of Malachi, the last book of the Hebrew Bible, his return is prophesied as the day of the Lord. When he comes back, God will be coming to change the world. At every single Passover celebration throughout history, everywhere in the world, a place is set at the table for Elijah. A cup, a seat, or something, waiting for his return. For Israel, Elijah defined what it meant to be a holy person sent by God. Every person in the history of Israel afterwards who saw themselves in some way as called by God to be a prophet modeled their lives after Elijah. And that's true in the New Testament as well. John the Baptist, just think about John the Baptist. John the Baptist lived out there in the wilderness and ate those locusts and wild honey and dressed in camel hair and looked like a wild man from the imagination that we have about him. And where did he get that? He got that from Elijah. He was living out the life of Elijah. When he saw himself called as a prophet, then he knew that he had to live as the stories of Elijah said Elijah lived, and speak as Elijah spoke. When Jesus began his own prophetic ministry, he asked the disciples who people said he was. And remember what the disciples said to him? Some people said to him, "You're like John the Baptist." And other people say you're Elijah. And so even Jesus, as he begins his prophetic ministry, apparently is modeling his life after John the Baptist, who had modeled his life after Elijah. And so when we ask the question, who was Jesus? The one thing we have to remember is that he lived his life inside this narrative framework that was dominated by the stories of Elijah. He would have heard those stories again and again growing up. And at every gathering he was at, talking about what it means to be a holy person and someone called by God, the name of Elijah would have been evoked, and the memories of Elijah would have been retold. And when he felt called to prophetic and healing ministry, he was following in the footsteps of Elijah. This is what it is to be a holy person. And so this is how he must have reasoned, I will seek to live my life. Now, the New Testament says that he put his own unique imprint on that framework He went about it in a different way than John the Baptist before him. But he lived out his own version of Elijah. Which brings us back to the ascension of Jesus. I mean, what does that... Now, thinking about the story of Elijah and then hearing again, thinking about what you just heard about the ascension of Jesus, it's Luke. Not only did Jesus model his own life after Elijah in some way, but then those who told the story of Jesus used that same narrative framework that they lived in to also frame the life of Jesus around key moments from the story of the prophet Elijah. And so Luke, and especially Luke more than any other Gospels, models the life of Jesus very much after the life of Elijah. And so Luke has Jesus at the very end, just as Elijah went up there in the whirlwind on the clouds. So Jesus also ascends on the clouds into heaven, just as Elijah. So the story, to me, it's not history. It's not what I understand as being history. You could have someone there with a camera rolling and they would have captured Jesus going up into heaven on the clouds. But the story is still of historic value because it allows us to see Luke's literary agenda, to understand that this is the model that he's following, using Elijah as a model. And it also still tells us something important about Jesus, because no one would have dared to compare Jesus to Elijah if there wasn't something to the memory of Jesus that he really did live his life in this way. And that when some people looked at Jesus and the life he lived, what it reminded them of was the prophet Elijah. And so there's a consistency there in the story that allows Luke to frame it and people to take that story and to believe it. So if you want to know who Jesus is, I mean, one way to do it is to try that, what I talked about the last couple of weeks is that during the modern period of historical Jesus research, and that's to try and weed out all of this narrative and actually boil it down to just the facts. What did Jesus say and what did Jesus do? And if we can't be absolutely certain that he said it and did it, we throw it out. It's of no use to us. That's one way to do Jesus research. But another way to do it is to allow that stuff to come back in and then to ask the question, why did they tell these stories? And what do the stories tell us about them and about Jesus? And then, you take that and you think about our lives. I mean, there are the facts of our lives. Someone could write a story of each and every one of us, a history, and maybe we could write it ourselves, and we could tell about when we were born, and when we threw our first ball, and when we said mama, and all those kind of things, and the facts, which are interesting, but they're not nearly as interesting as the stories that we tell, and the stories we grew up listening to. And if you want to know what our lives are really about, then the question to ask, I think, is what are the stories that we grew up listening to? What are those stories about influential people that have impacted our lives? And those stories are the stories that when we think about how we want to live our lives, we want to live like those people. So that when someone is telling the story of our life story sounds something like someone else who made a difference in the world. And I think it's a really pertinent question to continue to ask ourselves is, what are the stories that we are listening to? Because those stories are shaping our lives. What are the stories that we are listening to? What are the stories that we are telling? Because those stories are shaping the lives of others, children as well as others. What kind of a narrative framework do we live our lives out of? And what are the stories that we hope someday that people are talking about and telling about us, and how they have been impacted by us in those stories? So I invite you to think about this week. When you think about Jesus, you think about the narrative framework and the stories that he listened to that affected his life, and the stories that were then told about him, and then about your own life. What are the stories you listened to growing up? What are the stories you listen to now that are affecting your mind, your heart right now? And what are the stories that you are telling to others? Thank you for listening.